Hey guys, I'm learning TFT and I'm sharing my learnings with you so you can learn and I can learn better as well. In this video, I'm going to go through a detailed breakdown of patch 14.5 item performance by stage, where I broke down the stats, AVP, place change, win rate, frequency, as well as specifically the round win rates for stage 2, 4, and 6, as well as the best item holders and some notes for each. And then I put together a tier list where I'll walk through kind of the early game stage 2 item slams. And there are some nuances to interpreting this data, so I'll talk about some of the inherent kind of scenarios. Like, for example, Bramble Vest is going to be influenced by the Bramble augment. So, kind of figuring out how to interpret the data is important as well. And so, hopefully, by the end of this, we can get a better idea of what items we want to slam in the early game. Also, see general patterns between AD versus AP in this patch based off of the items. What are the best tank item slams, how those transition into the late game as well. So that's the goal for this video. If you want to jump to certain sections, like for the item tier list, I'll include timestamps in the description below. So with that said, let's dive into it. I don't think you can see. Okay, now you can see it. So I'm going to kind of focus on the stage 2 and then how it transitions into the late game. So one thing that you'll notice in a lot of these stats is that if you even just look at Meta TFT's early game analysis, this is stage 2 win rates, and I sorted by play rate. So the highest win rate and play rate here is both AD. And this is kind of could be AD or AP for Anima Squad. Elise, AP, but this is like highest play rate by far. And so for the most part, if you want a win streak in stage 2, you likely need to skew more towards AD. That's not to say that you can't win stage 2 with AP, but it's much more common to be able to do it with AD. So that's from a general trend perspective, you'll see that like Rageblade and IE will have slightly higher win rates than Shojin. Or let's say JG is 57% win rate in stage 2 versus IE 63%. You'll also notice that blue buff is particularly low, though I don't think that's necessarily because blue buff is a bad item. It actually scales really well relative to these other top frequency made items into the late game, because you have a lot of potential item holders in Vex, Annie, can even scale into Urgot, Viego, Zed here as well. But the big reason that blue buff, I suspect, has such a low win rate is because in order to get blue buff, because tier is still quite contested, you are typically lost streaking stage 2. So if they could actually filter this out by, let's say, you have Component Anvil or Pandora's items and you could slam an early blue buff with tempo, this I suspect would be a lot higher. But a lot of times I suspect people are making blue buff from a situation where they're lost streaking or maybe even full opening, which would skew this data a lot. Thieves Gloves, I would say, is likely from Augment, so likely skewed. There's, I think, Band of Thieves, yeah. Strikers, Flail here, I suspect is lower because you probably want to have a combination of IE or JG combined with Striker's Flail, or you have Executioners in. So I suspect that by the time stage 4 rolls around, it goes up for that reason, because you can get the item combination. Similarly, for Hextech Gunblade here, you don't really want to build this as your first item because the healing scales by the amount of damage that you deal. And if you have that as your first item, it's not really doing much. Whereas in stage 4, you are able to kind of hopefully have a 2 or 3 item carry that is able to amplify the healing involved. Giant Slayer, I suspect, is skewed because you lose a lot of the damage amp value in the early game, since for the most part, your opponents are not going to have 1750 HP tanks unless they have like a Warmog built. So I suspect that this is high only because you would only slam it if you have a bunch of 2-star units and you're trying to win streak. So it's not that you can't slam it, it's that this stat here is slightly skewed by the inherent board strength that would want to slam it in the first place. A stat skew for any item that requires double component of the same component in stage 2 is probably skewed because you can't get 2 of the same component in stage 1 from neutrals. So the only way you get this is off of like a item, augment, anvil start from the encounter. And Declaw in general, because we saw that most of the early game win streakers are going to be AD oriented, plus a lot of AP comps won't have much mana generation or AP built into their kit yet from items. Declaw in general is just not going to be as strong, especially in the early game. Also, we see that it's also not as strong in the late game. If we look at where's Bramble, it's like okay in the late game relative to Bramble. But you see here, even in the mid game, it's not as strong as Bramble. So Declaw just seems like a very mid item, especially since AD in the late game is quite prevalent right now. Bramble, we saw that is probably skewed by the Bramble augment, and likely you're only taking this if you're strong and already likely to win streak. Last Whisper, quite strong. Scales well into the late game. Protector's Vow, also quite strong. One pattern that I noticed too from the tanks, like if we just look at the early game stage 2 holders, Mundo and Silas for Warmogs, for Sunfire are going to be your early game best kind of early game tanks. And then stage 4, a lot of it is Leona Nico for a lot of the traditional tank items, and the best stage 6 holders are going to be Zach. Whereas the item holders for AD to cap out is Samira, Urgot. And for AP, you don't really have as much of a 5-cost cap out besides Viego, but Viego can be quite squishy. And so that's another reason that AD can really scale well into the late game. The exception being blue buff with Annie into, but like Strat Amp has one of the highest caps in the game, partially because it can still cap out into Samira. So AD is very good early and can scale well into the late game for stage 6. Whereas when we look at like Shojin, it doesn't really have a stage 6 5-cost like cap out. Like late game, Jewel Gauntlet can go onto Viego or Aurora. So that's like okay. And blue buff can go onto Urgot or Viego. Urgot is actually quite decent, so that's acceptable. All right, what else? Spark. Did we just talk about this? I forget. Spark, I would suspect that Spark is actually worse than this because there are situations that you might take the Spark augment, and that I assume you would mainly take if you could win streak. Maybe that's not always true. Similar to Bramble Vest. And if you are able to get an additional item, I would assume your win rate would be higher. So I suspect that means that if you were slamming this without the Spark augment, the win rate is probably even lower than this. So Spark just seems like a pretty bad slam early. Also because if you're slamming this, you probably don't have items on your backline AP carry. So that basically means your frontline is kind of your main damage source. So just not very good. Even Shroud, on the other hand, is probably quite good. And there's no Even Shroud augment, so the fact that this is higher than this, where you could get Spark as an extra item in the early game from an augment, means that Even Shroud is much better, which also reinforces the point that AD early game is going to be stronger than AP early game. Hodge early game, not surprising, not very good. It's mainly the melee carries, and the melee carries are hard to, like, they could still be quite squishy unless you're playing on item anvil or augment start where you can get maybe 2 items on a Shaco 2, for example. But other than that, like Hodge as a first slam is not very good. Red buff, probably also skewed by the augment. does quite well in the early mid game. Very much benefited from mostly AP, like Morg, Seraphine, Zyra, Elise. I think Elise was actually an 80% round win rate in stage 2 with that. So if you happen to have an Elise, have an orb, and can get the red buff augment, I would highly recommend going this route because you have a very good chance of full streaking stage 2 and 3. BT, not very good for the same reason as Hodge. Steadfast Heart, we talked about being quite strong. This and Crown Guard here are probably the best tank items for stage 2, but actually this is likely skewed. Crown Guard is likely skewed by the augment as well. So Steadfast is probably the best tank stage 2 tank item, like just purely from a stats standpoint, if you were to account for the like Bramble augment and the Crown Guard augment. Given that those augments you would mainly take those if you were already like strong on in trying to streak in your early game. Oh, by the way, Spear Visage and Kraken's Fury did not show up in the stats on Meta TFT, and all this data, by the way, you can view yourself if you go to items, and let's say I pull up Shojin. Here shows the performance by stage as well as the item holders round win rate. So you can access that data on your own as well. I forgot to mention that this was updated on the day after the patch, May 30th, filter Diamond Plus to have a reasonable sample size. Void Staff is the new shred that does not... it only affects the units that are attacked or hit by abilities. So the number of units that it will benefit has decreased. So it doesn't seem to be as good of an early game slam as last patch, where it could actually deal a sizable amount of damage. Shiv in the past has been quite strong in the early game, whereas this seems like it's quite neutral now. Archangel Staff is scaling AP. Not very good. If we compare to Rageblade 63% versus 62% round win rate, we've seen last set that when I did this that I suspect the reason for both Rageblade and Archangel not having as high round win rates in the beginning is because if you are slamming this, you probably don't have a tank item yet. And so your front line could just fall apart despite having this scaling in the back line. So it gets a lot stronger once you have a 2-star tank, 2-star carry that's carrying your Archangel Staff or Rageblade, and you have like a Stone Plate, for example, slammed. Crown Guard, quite reasonable, especially good on Mordekaiser early game. Adaptive, quite flexible, not amazing. Nashor's Tooth, surprisingly, was quite good on Graves in the early game because he doesn't have mana, but I think it was like every 2 attacks he does his little burst. And so that procs the Nashor's Tooth value. And scales well into the late game with Annie. So Graves can be both a Aphelios and Annie item holder for Vertical Golden Ox. Deathblade, very good in the stats. You can't get 2 swords from neutrals, I think, unless... Yeah, so it's likely skewed by an item augment or component anvil start, but very strong because it's flat damage, and the flat damage just influence is a lot more impactful in the early game. Edge of Night, not very good early game, much better in the late game, getting the aggro drop. Morello, similar to Red Buff. Red Buff here. Basically, same users. Red Buff likely skewed by the Red Buff augment. So the stats on both of them are probably quite similar if you exclude the Red Buff augment. Rabadon, double component of the same component. You are unlikely to be able to get this in the first part of stage 2. The fact that this is low, like you would only slam it early part of stage 2 if you had like an item augment or component anvil start. So I suspect it's actually worse than this. Because if you're slamming it, you probably are trying to streak. Titan's Resolve, not very good. Quicksilver, decent, especially good on Shaco. And not very good in the mid game, but Aphelios likes it in the late game. And then the new Sterak's, I was looking at the stats comparing this patch and last patch, and it's quite similar in the early game. There are a lot of holders, Vi, Shaco, Rengar, Graves, Mundo, and skills well into the late game as well. So given this kind of analysis, we can then go into, I broke this down into a like kind of the round win rates, but then trying to account for like some of these biases into a tier list for stage 2 item slams. And this is what I came up with. I would probably lower Crown Guard actually after seeing, I forgot that you can get it from an augment. But you'll see here that the carry slams are pretty much all AD, and the tank slams, at least Bramble is an item augment. Warmog you can't really get unless you have a component start, but the flat boost in HP is very, very impactful. And Steadfast we talked about as probably being the best, like just straight up tank item in the early game. The anti-heals kind of lean you in an AP direction since the best holders are AP. Even Shroud quite good. Sterak's quite good on a lot of tanks. And then we see here that most of the AP and melee especially is down here. The only real holder is going to be Shaco. Although, like Graves, you could definitely play around more if you happen to hit like a Graves 2, or you have just a really good frontline. Void Staff and Spark both down here. Striker's Flail we discussed, only really good if you already have IE or JG built or you're playing Executioners, but Executioners is really hard to play around in the early game. Blue Buff, I suspect is actually quite good, but if you're getting 2 tiers, you either got it from Augment Encounter or you probably lost streaked with an open tier. So that's influencing the round win rate for that. And yeah, that's like kind of the general trend here. And then Declaw, just AP is just not as strong, especially in the early game. A lot of the AP comps like Brand and StratAmp do have high cap outs, but you don't really need to build Declaw in the early game. You could build it in the late game as a result of that. Most of the damage is going to be AD in the early game. So I hope that this analysis is helpful for you. I'll include links to this page and this page in the description below. I would love to hear your thoughts if you have any additional feedback, questions, stuff you want to add in terms of the analysis in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.